Okay, ladies, this screencast is going to cover Chapter 14, which is entitled Imperialism. Imperialism in this chapter is the introductory chapter to Unit 5, which is going to primarily focus on World War I. One thing I want to highlight, if you consider the fact that in Iron-Jawed Angels, we saw a little bit about World War I, we are kind of backtracking, kind of rewinding time a little bit. So in terms of like Unit 4, focusing on like the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age and turn of the century, all of this stuff kind of overlaps. But in Unit 4, we were looking at U.S. history from a domestic agenda, point of view, like looking at our domestic policies, what's happening within the United States. Whereas Unit 5 very much focuses on our foreign agenda and our relationship with other nations and how we are kind of influencing and growing our influence globally. So I first want to give an overall definition of imperialism. Imperialism is when stronger nations extend economic, political, or military control over weaker nations. So kind of going beyond the scope of national borders, and whether it's colonizing or influencing or just kind of using for resources, exploiting resources really in other nations outside of one's own country. That is what imperialism is. And we're going to start seeing in this unit U.S. foreign policy shifting towards engaging in imperialistic relationships. For so long, it's been more so that we've been isolationists, not really intervening or getting involved often, in international affairs, but that's going to really switch at this point in history. Two examples we're going to first talk about is how we came to acquire what will become our last two states, Alaska and Hawaii. So in 1867, the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia for about 2 cents an acre, which is a pretty good deal. Alaska, as you know, is part of North America. It's physically connected to, Canada. But if you look at the map, you notice that it's very close to Russia when you cross the Bering Strait, kind of more so like on the east side or, eastern hemisphere, the west side of the map. So Alaska is very rich in resources. It has a lot of oil, timber, other minerals. So that is why we would want to buy Alaska. It won't become a state until later in the 1950s, but we did purchase it very diplomatically from Russia at this point. Our acquisition of Hawaii is not so diplomatic. It kind of involves in a growing trade relationship that eventually turns into an imperialistic relationship. So basically, we were trading with Hawaii for their sugarcane and their pineapples that they grew on their plantations. Hawaii was occupied by like native Hawaiians, and they were in control of Hawaii. They even had a monarchy, where at the time, we'll get to this main female monarch, the last Hawaiian monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. You can see that picture and her name spelled on your PowerPoint on the screen, just because that's obviously a hard name to spell, but that is her name, and there she is. So we are trading heavily with Hawaii, and you actually see the U.S., like some farmers like setting up and purchasing like sugarcane plantations like on Hawaii, on the islands. Well, the U.S. eventually puts a tax on foreign sugar to protect American sugarcane farmers, and Hawaiian sugar will then become very expensive because when you have a tax on imports, then the price of the product is raised to make up for that tax. And so you have American, and white sugarcane farmers out of Hawaii who now are losing their profits because Americans are no longer purchasing imported sugar. So white planters in Hawaii will ask the U.S. to annex the Hawaiian Islands to avoid these tariffs, okay? Meaning if Hawaii was part of U.S. territory, then the taxes wouldn't apply to them. It doesn't take much convincing for the U.S. to be on board with this because, honestly, the strategic, placement of Hawaii, it is very much on the way to Asia. Thus, it would make a really great place for a harbor, a naval harbor, consider where Pearl Harbor is located today. So the U.S. Marines will help the white planters in Hawaii overthrow the female monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, and they will set up a white governor, Sanford Doyle. Now, the president at the time was Cleveland. He actually refused to annex Hawaii in the beginning, but later, in 1897, President William McKinley will annex Hawaii as an American territory, but the Hawaiian people never had a chance to vote on it. So honestly, it's very much a situation where Hawaii and the Hawaiians were overpowered, and Hawaii was essentially taken by force by the U.S. military. And once again, in the 1950s, Hawaii would become the 50th and final U.S. state, at least for now. Okay, so those are two kind of examples of just specific territories that became states. We'll now kind of look at other examples of American imperialism during this point, the turn of the century, through the main example of the Spanish-American War. So we're going to look at Cuba with this. I know I said Spanish-American War, but at this point in history, late 1800s, Spain is still occupying and in control of Cuba. However, Spain was losing its world power overall in terms of its colonies within the Americas. And the U.S. is pretty interested in Cuba because of its sugarcane industry. You actually have, American farmers and American businessmen investing millions of dollars in the Cuban, sugarcane industry. And at the same time that, we're becoming invested in them business-wise, Cuba themselves, the nation itself is trying to overthrow Spain and become independent from Spanish control. So there's a Cuban uprising. They actually tried a couple times. So this particular war is actually Cuba's second war for independence. But Cubans are trying to overthrow the Spanish, and they're actually hoping the U.S. would help since we are so invested in their nation. What's going to end up happening is American newspapers are very invested in, this war taking place because, times of conflict generate a lot of stories, a lot of national attention, a lot of business for the newspapers, which sounds terrible, but people will read, more when things are bad and when there's, kind of these, explosive stories and people are very interested in them. So what's going to end up happening is there's a competition between two different newspapers. One owned by Randolph Hearst, one owned by Joseph Pulitzer. I'll actually never require you to know those names, but there is a competition between these newspapers. They're basically just trying to see who can sell more. Drama sells more easily. So both newspapers will produce very exaggerated accounts of what is happening within Cuba. They basically paint a very gruesome picture of how the Spanish are treating the Cubans, with very gruesome details, but they're completely made up for the most part. So it's all false, just to gain national. One of the publishers, Hearst, even sent out his own artists to draw sketches of the revolt in Cuba, the Cuban revolt, of trying to overthrow the Spanish. And when the artist kind of reports back that things are not as bad as we're describing them to be, I don't know how to draw, these images, to your liking, when it would be false. Hearst replied, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." So that just kind of shows how far these, newspaper publishers are willing to go to get business. All of those stories, though, are effective in, causing Americans to really, be outraged at what Spain is doing and how the Spaniards are treating the Cubans and that, the U.S. should intervene. President McKinley is trying to keep the U.S. out of this conflict because it really doesn't have anything to do with us. But the U.S. public opinion is starting to shift in favor of war. Eventually, you have a Cuban, in the event known as the Delome letter, you have a Cuban revolutionary steal a private letter from the Spanish ambassador in Cuba. Delome was his last name, but the Spanish ambassador criticizes President McKinley for being weak. And that note gets published in a newspaper. So we know now that the, Spanish government is criticizing our president, and that even angers and enrages the American public even further. They feel like the U.S. should stand up for themselves and not allow Spain to kind of, say these terrible things. And then the last and, kind of straw here is going to be the sinking of the Maine, or the explosion of the USS Maine. So a couple days after the publishing of the DeLone letter, the USS Maine, which is a U.S. naval ship, is sent to Cuba to protect American citizens and interests, just to kind of oversee everything that's happening, not an act of war, not an invasion, just to kind of monitor the situation. But while it was in the harbor of Havana, it exploded into flames. It burst into flames, and about 200 men were killed, obviously, mostly sailors. The yellow journalists will immediately blame this on the Spanish, basically, saying, oh, Spain attacked an American ship. The reality is we never found a cause of this explosion. So there was never a definite conclusion in terms of how this ship exploded or what happened. Nonetheless, remember the Maine kind of becomes a battle cry for wanting to declare war against Spain to punish them. And if I didn't highlight this earlier, when I said the yellow journalists, that action of producing very kind of falsified, exaggerated accounts, that's called yellow journalism. So these two newspapers that are competing would be considered yellow journalists. Okay, so we're pretty much now going to have to, we're pretty much going to be pulled into war with Spain at this point, okay? And in 1898, the United States is officially going to declare war against Spain. So we initially fight the Spanish in the Philippines, which I know seems bizarre, but the Philippines were under the colonial control of Spain. So it's like we're not fighting the Filipino people, we're fighting the Spanish in the Philippines or at the Philippines. The U.S. fleet will sail into the Philippines, where the Filipino people will actually help the Americans, because they hope that if the Americans overthrow the Spanish successfully, that they will then gain their independence. Unfortunately, when the Spanish surrender to the U.S. at the Philippines, the U.S. will maintain control of the Philippines as a protectorate, which is where we are kind of, politically, economically controlling the nation, but we're protecting them in return. The U.S. will also fight in the Caribbean, several places, obviously in Cuba, because that was kind of the source of this conflict from the get-go. The U.S. Navy will blockade Cuban ports, but the U.S. Army, honestly, was made up of poorly trained soldiers, volunteer soldiers. You do have one group that gets a lot of notoriety, the Rough Riders, led by one Mr. Teddy Roosevelt. If you kind of recall, we've talked about Teddy Roosevelt as the president. This is prior to his presidency, when he was just a war hero from the Spanish-American War. But Teddy Roosevelt led a volunteer cavalry force in Cuba. There were honestly dozens of other units. There's just several other units, that were successful with the Rough Riders, but the Rough Riders get all of the accreditation and just the credit and the attention from this, all the notoriety. But eventually, with groups like the Rough Riders, the U.S. was able to defeat the Spanish in Cuba. And then we were also able to take Puerto Rico without a fight. So Puerto Rico was also captured in the Caribbean, and that was also something that was occupied by Spain, but now it will be occupied by us. We have another Treaty of Paris, ladies, so remember we need to know the year, because that's the only thing that kind of then distinguishes it separately from the other treaties of Paris we've discussed. So this is the Treaty of Paris, 1898, which will end the Spanish-American War. The two sides will meet in Paris, and the following things were decided. Cuba gained independence from Spain, but was technically under American control for some time. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit more. Spain cedes, C-E-D-E-S, like cession. Okay, Spain cedes both Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S., so those were given to us as wins, wins of the war. And Spain will also sell the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. So we have very much shifted from a stance of isolationism to a stance of imperialism, and we will continue talking about this in the next screencast.